Well, welcome everyone. I am so glad that you're here to support authors and local readers and of course Grassroots. I'm Ashley, the events and social media coordinator at Grassroots, and tonight we have author and OSU instructor George Estreich to read from 3 of his books. So a brief introduction. George Estreich is the author of a poetry collection, Textbook Illustrations of the Human Body, the Oregon Book Award-winning memoir, The Shape of the Eye, and Fables and Futures, Biotechnology, Disability, and the Stories We Tell Ourselves. His essays and articles have appeared in the New York Times, Aeon, the American Medical Association Journal of Ethics, and McSweeney's Internet Tendency. He lives in Oregon with his family. So here's the way that tonight's reading will work. George will lead a reading and presentation from his books, and then we'll open up the floor to a Q&A from audience members for the last 20 or so minutes or however long we have. So please feel free to use the chat box to indicate if you have a question during the presentation. Afterwards, we'll use that to run the Q&A portion. I also want to note that the link to buy George's books will be in the chat shortly. I highly encourage you to buy them from us. Not only will you be supporting George as an author, but also Grassroots as a small local indie bookstore that's able to bring events like this to you. So all that being said, George, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And thank you everyone for being here. This really means a lot. Opportunities for this kind of thing when we're in the midst of our semi-quarantine are a lot fewer. So thank you for being here. Thanks to Grassroots. And just echoing what Ashley said, please, this is a time to support our local independent bookstores and especially Grassroots. You know, I don't know what the new normal is going to look like when we're on the other side of this, but we need our independent stores to be there for us. And that means it's our turn to support them now. So just a shout out to them. Thank you. So the screen you see here are my books. So I'm going to read from 3 of them and then talk a little bit about the 4th one that I've contributed to. And so I'm going to start just going in chronological order with my book of poems. So let's see. Here we go. Textbook Illustrations of the Human Body. You know, I went back to this book because I thought it was kind of a cool idea to, read a little bit from all of my books. And I was reading through these poems, and they're like really depressing and long, a lot of them. And so I kind of winnowed it down to a couple. This first poem is called Twilight Poconos. And it's about fishing on a little lake in the Poconos, but it is also about thinking about my mother's father. My mother's from Japan, so her father, and who seems to have been a really eccentric person. I had the distinct idea all through my childhood that it would be not a good thing if I turned into him or was like him. So I thought about him a lot, and he showed up in this poem. Twilight Poconos. One fish in the bucket. The fog lowers. The uncaught fish knows through the depths of the mirror I've plumbed all day. Now the evening advances, slow as alcohol, and I tip the bucket into the shallows. The bluegill hovers, an image of water against the water, then shoots away. It carries on its gill cover a slash of black calligraphic ink, a blunt comma, tribute to the pause between words, the breath dividing the sentence. That mark is where I live. The glossy black of Japanese hair and Japanese ink. I remember the rectangular stone with its sloped well and scraping the ink stick slowly, counting the strokes, the water deepening, blue into black. I stood proudly at the stove, holding up the name I'd scrawled in Japanese phonetics, my mother believing I'd become ambassador to the country she left long ago, whose dead she now hears about on the telephone. This poem is for her father, who rolled wartime cigarettes in dictionary paper, who used to fish alone in the mountains with his jointed bamboo rod and his hand-tied flies, who said privately that the B-29s looked beautiful in a way, silver up there. I send these words to him like a handful of smoke from the temple censer to rub on the part afflicted. This next poem is called Hand Plane, and which I think is pretty self-explanatory. It's only a mirror, it divides. It says, there is waste, a pile of shavings. Here is a pattern, a revealed surface, a deepened opacity. You could do this all day, just for the motion, the mindless, watchful rocking, the buried knots and voids unblurring slowly like rocks from an ebbing tide, the lines trailing and eddying their long skeins, and the surface changing with each stroke, with each dry wave curling upwards, in the way it answers the light's question, in the way it rephrases the light's question as a kind of answer. The right word is an edge, a near perfect angle. Its metal polished to mirror the world it pairs into translucence. Say it aloud, the unwritten word, the word honed on silence, whose edge lifts the dry wave of an image from the day's ocean, whose edge lifts you from yourself in dry waves of revision. The hand plane whispers it over and over. And now the last poem I'm going to read is not actually in the book. I've not ever actually read it before, and I think you'll see why. It's more of a visual poem. So it's this. And so this is a concrete poem or shaped poem, and I don't advise ever writing one. It's a colossal pain to write. You need graph paper and all the rest. But this is called Reasons for Building. A child could see it in the sun, the sloping lines of the roof, and under moonlight, the lit windows and figures moving inside the shadow. And I liked the blueprints where the house in its east elevation floated against a dark ground, an incision in twilight. I wanted to construct an image of home. I wanted a self-portrait in wood and wire and concrete, a version of the body, that soft clock I bear from place to place, the mismatched gears of its heart and lungs, the coiled mainspring of its code, the restlessness of its perpetual movement. I wanted a place fixed against motion, an absence defined against the intricate, sunlit rooms to stop time. I wanted that it be mine, not in title alone, that dwelling of paper, but by the labor of hands indeed. For a house is a vision descending into the paradise of details, settling itself in place, a weighted image, something seen through. So I marked off a site with string, then began to dig. And it seemed like archaeology, the brick fragments, Coke cans, wisps of insulation, a nail half buried in clay, and a house unearthed day by day in the slow reconstruction of a life. I stayed there even before I was done, lying each night on my floor, looking up at stars, a map of the undone drifting overhead, divided by darkened beams. It seemed the negative of a house of light, an image reversed. I thought form was permanent, and that measure was the soul of form, the line leveled against the world. Sleeping like a child, I dreamed 30 seconds of an inch beneath the exploded diagram of my life, those lit ruins sinking each night into the earth and rising as a single star. Okay, so this is just like this kind of almost geological fast forward. Like these books took like 10 years each to write, but we're just going to zip through them in like 10 minutes a piece. This is the first prose book I wrote. Is called The Shape of the Eye, and it's about my daughter Laura. That's her on the cover. Who's born in 2001 and shortly after diagnosed with Down syndrome. And as you can imagine, that changed a lot for me, for how I thought about family and being a parent and everything else. And so this book is about being Laura's dad and about that process of rethinking everything. And I'm going to read a couple of short passages from the first half of the book. So this first passage this comes from when Laura was around 4 months old. So she was born with a fairly serious heart defect. So she needed her heart repair at 4 months, and had a pretty rough time of it in the hospital for the first several days. But a little later on, when she seemed to be stabilizing, Teresa and I wondered if we could go out together. So this is actually a story about a date. One night, when Laura seemed stable enough for us to go out, we left. We drove away from our unconscious daughter and went to a restaurant. We asked the nurses, "Is it okay? Can we both go out and eat?" In another room on the unit, there was a girl about 2 years old who was unconscious and alone day and night. There were whispers, an ugly breakup, parents living far away. But the nurses had smiled and sent us ahead. We ate at a restaurant that prides itself on its spicy food, its floor covered with peanut shells. On the walls were Polaroids of men who had eaten enough hot peppers to have their Polaroids taken. We sat, freedom eclipsing guilt. We'd always left the hospital one at a time, the other keeping the vigil. And though our sense of urgency was fading, we were still at care level 6 on the big whiteboard by the ICU entrance. We'd come in at level 7. 7 was the night Laura crashed, and 2 nurses in the room around the clock. 7 was the girl whose cancer had returned, and the young man whose pediatric heart defect had finally caught up with him, and the teenage boy whose ATV had flipped, leaving him with multiple skull fractures. So it was good to be at level 6. At 5, we would leave for the newborn care unit, Laura suddenly enormous among the preemies, but for now, we were still waiting. Only by leaving the hospital, only by entering the miscellaneous world of shoppers and workers and children squalling in jogging strollers could we glimpse what we were holding back. The hospital was beautiful, all that any parent could ask for. It had muted tile and stone and wood, and wide expanses of glass along the hallways, admitting what sunlight the Willamette Valley begrudges. The artwork was appropriately Northwestern, with a standard issue mix of whimsy and reverence for nature that characterizes our summer festivals, the acrylically bright leaping salmon, the elk and beaver and turtles cast in bronze. It had a room for meditation, a quietly lit space with a radiating sun inlaid in the floor, and a guest book filled with anguished prayers to Jesus. I felt lucky to be there, remembering the oppressive atmosphere of other hospitals I'd been in, the windowless hallways and cramped rooms, but in the end, the effect was less healing than anesthetic. Inside the hospital, we were numb, separate. Deprived of comparison, we felt okay. Laura's blood pressure dropped and climbed. Her infection responded to the 3rd antibiotic they tried, and on, and we managed. We were fine. But when we emerged, the dream bubble burst. We'd smell air unscented by disinfectant. We'd walk on actual sidewalks. No one was wearing scrubs. There were no sobbing extended families spilling into the hallways. There were objects everywhere, not individually wrapped for single use. And we felt like we'd won a dream vacation, an all expenses paid trip to the Disney World of normal life. It was kind of nice. We'd breathe in deeply and only then realize we'd been holding our breath. We had one daughter watching Cinderella in Pennsylvania and another in intensive care, but it was a date. When we got back to the hospital, we had to be buzzed back in like teenagers after curfew. We went back upstairs. Everything was quiet. Laura was fine. So this next is just like a little kind of one-page section, and it's, I mean, people who know me as father know how much my kids are to me. I mean, it's just unquantifiable, and it's weird to even mention it. But it took a little longer with Laura. It took a little longer to just sort that out. And this is about realizing that process in the middle of it. It occurred to me only later that when Laura was in the hospital, I did not yet love her. I may only have been looking after her. Perhaps that was why, looking down at her prostrate in a hospital bed, I was glad she was not Ellie. Perhaps those early weeks were only a down payment on a love we might come to feel. Or I did not allow myself to love her in order to save myself the pain. Thinking this, I knew it was true. At the same time, I knew, because I could think it, it was no longer true. I remember when the thought first occurred to me. It was August, some weeks after we'd gotten home from the hospital. I was in my workshop, holding Laura in the ancient shed behind the house. I was looking for something essential to the furthering of a whim, a bolt, a tube of epoxy resin, an adjustable wrench, who knows what, for who knows what project. Though I dislike football and guy is a dialect I speak only with difficulty, I do answer stress with power tools, and I also look after children at home. So I held Laura, careful to keep her away from every sharp, pointed, and electrified thing in the shop, and rooted through sawdust and debris with my free hand. She was braced in the crook of my left arm. I leaned away from her to keep us both balanced. She twisted this way and that, inspecting the piles of offcuts from finished projects, the flickering shop lights, the exposed studs dark with age, the 2x4s not nominal, but actually 2 inches by 4 inches. And as I stood by the pull-down ladder, the late morning sunlight turning the dust over in its hands, I saw Laura and realized what she was to me. I gathered her against me and told her so, in the best words I could find at the time. Then I carried her back into the house. So I'm going to move on to the most recent book now, and that's Fables and Futures. So this for me was, well, every book's been a departure, so I didn't have a normal to depart from, but it was a different kind of book. It's the first book I've ever written with an index. It was really research intensive. As you can kind of tell from the samples of the book of poems and the memoir, those are really exposed and personal in a conventional way. And this is not so much. This is more looking outward than inward, and trying to the extent that I look inward, trying to leverage that to get the reader to think about things that they might not have thought about. So, brief description of the book. So, going by the title, Biotechnology, Disability, and the Stories We Tell Ourselves. So, on one level, it is about biotechnology, and specifically biotech aimed at the human, and more specifically at human genes. So as never before, we have technological applications able to decipher and alter our own DNA. DNA is the code we begin with. It's the molecule that contains the instructions for building, maintaining, and replicating an organism. Fertilized egg, it contains DNA from mom and dad. So we can read that and write it as the metaphor goes. This gives us power. This gives us power over the category human, because it gives us increasing power over the lives to come. So to the extent that it's about biotech, it's about that. But the book is really about stories. We tell stories to explore what it means to be human in the first place. But stories are also used in a persuasive way to sell biotechnologies to us. I am interested in how those stories work. I'm interested in the role disability plays and the stories that people with disabilities tell about their own lives. And I wanted to write a book where they all came together. So my approach is to combine narrative and scholarship. And in other words, I try and dissect some of the stories aimed at us while telling stories of my own. So this first bit is from latest in the book, and it's from a chapter called Model Worlds. And it begins with a story about playing board games with Laura, but I was interested in the board game as a model of life. We used to kill time playing life. When Laura was 9, it was her favorite board game, probably for its number of tiny parts and the amount of time an average game consumed. If we were playing life, we were by definition not occupied with the ephemera of life. We were fully present, or mostly so. I'd fit the first trimester-sized pink and blue pegs into a plastic car, spin the plastic wheel, and trundle through a generic story of weddings and mortgages and tuition. I'd glance toward the laptop and then glance away. Every board game constrains the world. In Clue, the players roll dice like gods above a crime, tracing the threads of fate with golf pencils. Laura liked Clue. Chutes and Ladders was easier to understand and better for working on counting, but the game is boring, merciless, and unjust. As soon as you clamber ahead of everybody, you slide back down. At the end, you can wait for turn after turn before rolling the exact right number to win. Also, you have to switch directions while counting, left to right and then right to left, when one direction is hard enough, which is how we came to Monopoly Junior. If Clue abstracts murder, and life abstracts life, and Monopoly abstracts capitalism, then Monopoly Junior abstracts the abstraction. It is a model of an artificial world. In his great essay, The Search for Marvin Gardens, John McPhee alternates scenes from a fierce, rapid, mano-a-mano game of Monopoly with scenes from the real Atlantic City. We understand that the impulse to compete and dominate gave rise to the actual urban blight transformed in the game into plastic hotels, property cards, and silver hats. In Monopoly Junior, Atlantic City has been replaced with an amusement park. Purple is the balloon stand. Blue is the Echo Canyon coaster. Jail is lunch. Free parking is free time. Houses and hotels are replaced by ticket booths. Luxury taxes, assessments per house, mortgages, all gone. It's $2 to see the water show or the fireworks. The lowest denomination is $1, the highest $5. There is a single die. There are no utilities, and the railroads have been scrubbed of place, toil, and capital. They are simply red, blue, yellow, and green, and they cannot be owned. If you land on one, you just roll again. We liked Monopoly Junior. It was a manageable, Laura-sized world. We played until the board filled up with ticket booths, or Laura won, whichever came first. I rarely won. Laura was the Dale Carnegie of unreality. She'd land on free time and gather the bad luck of others, the taxes on others' misfortunes. She'd accumulate ticket booths, draw lucky cards from chance. The games were models of life. They granted endless possibility within severe and artificial limits. But I did not know if the model's assumptions would hold for Laura or what possibilities she might have. What would her life be like? What relevance did they have? These abstracted nuclear families, taking their winding journeys in plastic cars, acquiring pink and blue children. How would Laura fare in the amusement park of capitalism, its random movement from one entertainment to the next, its accumulation of symbolic wealth? What happens when the child outgrows the game? What we told ourselves then was true. Laura was acquiring skills and language, learning to interact. But as we approach the cliff of 18, as Laura's school career comes to an end, I know that the preparations we make are necessary and insufficient. Laura loves school more than anything. Her high school is a model in every sense, both a distillation of society and a shelter from its dangers. But the model is not the world. The scientists are playing life. In mouse models, in cell lines, sequencers, beakers, petri dishes, in algorithms that create virtual children or predict diagnoses for future ones, in synthetic cells embedded with coded quotes from James Joyce, the molecule that becomes us is sequenced, altered, copied, studied, compared, in vitro, in silico, in vivo. In 2013, researchers in Jean Lawrence's lab at the University of Massachusetts reported that they had found a way to, quote, silence the extra chromosome associated with Down syndrome in vitro. That is, to prevent the genes of the extra chromosome from being expressed into proteins. Because people with Down syndrome have 3 copies of each gene instead of 2, their proteins are overexpressed, which alters both development and function. Lawrence had adapted the mechanism that prevents overexpression in female mammals. Since females inherit 2 X chromosomes, one is automatically turned off by a gene known as XIST. The gene codes not for a protein, but for a long stretch of RNA. That RNA, as science writer Ed Yong explains, coats one of the 2 X chromosomes and condenses it into a dense, inaccessible bundle. It's like crunching up a book's pages to make them unreadable and useless. The gene's name is pronounced exist. To silence the extra chromosome, the researchers inserted copies of exist into cells taken from a boy with Down syndrome. The boy's cells had been reprogrammed to behave like pluripotent stem cells. That is, cells that can potentially become any kind of cell, as opposed to cells whose developmental fate is already decided. The cells were then cultured, and the exist gene was inserted with zinc finger nucleases, a genome editing tool. The experiment worked. The book of the extra chromosome was rendered unreadable, and as the cells divided, they developed more normally. The boy was present in the model as code, but some of his code had been silenced, and his cells had become something else. So what interested me about this experiment was the way the researchers talked about its significance. On the one hand, they were hoping for a treatment in living people with Down syndrome, but their justification for the experiment noted what they called enormous medical and social costs caused by Down syndrome. These are difficult questions, but it's that doubleness that I've noticed since Laura was born, that double sense of, is this someone to treat or is this someone whom we experience as a tragedy? And it's interesting to see that percolate up through a scientific paper. So that's another side of the model. I want to skip ahead now and continue this idea of model worlds, and but dip back in history. And I want to talk about a peculiar thing that from institutions. One thing I did when writing this book was read up on the history of American eugenics and particularly institutions. And one thing that I found was a description of this educational tool called the object lesson. And this happened in institutions early in the 20th century. And what it meant was that the people who were institutionalized, then called feeble-minded, were given toy versions of the real world. Little houses, little streets to play with. And the difficult thing to think about as we look back to that is that the rationale was that they were being prepared for the outside world. The fact was that they were never going to get there. So I wanted to play with this in this chapter, looking at Laura's actual life, which is good, and think of it in terms of the larger sweep of the world that she is going to enter. Okay. Let's see, how are we doing on time, Ashley? Where are we at?
7:30 now, so.
Yeah, let me, so I'll stop Fables and Futures there, and I'll talk briefly about this last book that I want to talk about, and then hopefully take some questions. Okay. So with the theme of a departure, this is a new book for me. And it's not my book. It's a book written by my friend, Allison Pietmeyer. Allison was a dear friend. She died of brain cancer in 2016. That's her with her daughter, Maybelle. And Allison had worked on a book for a long time about parenting and prenatal testing. And some of it was research-based in that she talked to parents who had received a diagnosis in utero and either decided to terminate or to carry their children to term. And she was just fascinated with the complexities of their stories and the conundrums they faced. So this book is partly about that, and it's partly first person, Allison telling her own story. Before she died, a few weeks before, she asked if I would complete the book for her because it was undone. And I said yes, but then I immediately realized this was not something I could do. So my friend Rachel Adams came on and joined me, and together we co-edited this book and not the words are mostly Allison's, but we patched, jigsawed, assembled, and completed the book. It's going to be out in February from NYU Press. And the one thing I want to leave you with is this metaphor that we use for our job, and that is the idea of Kinsugi. So this is a Japanese art whereby something that is broken is assembled with sort of adhesive laced with gold. And when you put something back together, you highlight the break and you make it whole again. this is the metaphor that governs what we did. We didn't seek to hide the seams. We wanted to highlight them, but we wanted to assemble them. And the resonance in Allison's own life is that late in her life, she was a Star Wars fan, and she had a favorite Star Wars mug, and it dropped. And this was because this was late. You know, she was really sick then, and it was just a horrible day, which she wrote a beautiful blog post about. And her husband and her brother found someone to repair the mug. So this is it. And so to me, you know, it was actually a friend of Rachel's and mine, Giordano Mendelsohn, who suggested the metaphor, and we kind of ran with it. But in many ways, that just seemed the best description of our project that we could find. So it'll be out from NYU in February. I'm happy to answer more questions about it. But apart from that, thank you everyone for listening, and I would love to hear your questions.
Thank you for presenting, George.
Of course.
Does anyone want to kick off the Q&A? Any burning questions to start with?
You can put something in the chat, or you know, turn on your microphone, or however you want to do it.
If not, I am happy to kick us off.
Looks like Elena had a question.
Oh, perfect. Elena.
Hello. I hope you'll forgive me not turning my camera on, but I think it's probably best for everyone. I'm wondering, that was wonderful, George, and really just so intimidating that you're moving from a book of wonderful poems to a memoir to this science-based sort of analysis of storytelling to editorship. And I'm wondering, you know, you've never done the same thing twice, really significant degree. Like, so do you feel like you still have, are you moving forward to the point where, you know, will you ever write a poetry book again? Or do you think you'll ever want to try a memoir again? Or does it feel sort of like those are former selves now that you're, you know, a couple decades and 4 books in?
So thank you, Elena. I mean, I think it's like restlessness on a decade scale or something. I don't know. I could see writing poetry again. I've written like a couple of poems in the last couple of years. I'm working on, I guess, more criticism now, right now, writing about Helen MacDonald. But I think the next thing, I hope the next thing is essay, because I've written a few essays, but I've never put together a full book, and I would like to do that. I don't envision a memoir because, I mean, the thing that happened with Laura was like my story, and things are really acceptably boring right now. I'm glad nothing as exciting is happening as like watching a kid crashing in the ICU. And more and more I want to look outward, talk less about myself. So poetry maybe, memoir probably not, essays almost certainly. Does that answer?
Yeah, but it makes me kind of want to watch my back if you're moving to essays. Like us essayists, we better look out, man.
You have nothing to worry about. Yeah, no, yeah, you have nothing to worry about.
Looks like Rebecca had a question about which genre will be next. Rebecca, was your question answered?
Yes.
All right.
It's so great to see everyone here, like from so many parts of my life. This is like the end of Titanic. It's great.
I see a question here from Stephen, if you want to ask that. Or I can read it out.
Yeah. Can you just speak a little about your research, how it works, and like what's the point where you know you've you learned about something enough to be able to speak about it, especially to audiences who, some of whom might be familiar with what you're writing about, some of whom might be more of a popular audience?
That's a really, really good question. And, you know, I mean, as you know, to be a writer of nonfiction is essentially to be a trespasser all the time. Like everyone else in the academy knows stuff and we just do stuff. We like write these sentences. And so, I never know enough. I think much more about how do I frame my ignorance? Like, so in the introduction to Fables and Futures, it was like, I am an amateur. I am embracing the amateur tradition of the essay and nonfiction. My rationale for it was that since we were talking about species alteration, we can't all wait to be experts to start weighing in. And in fact, using expertise as a bar is one of the pernicious things that is done. But the other thing I do is I try and just find reliable translators. And the ideal is someone like my friend Nathaniel Comfort is one example, who's a historian of science, but also is a really, really good writer. And just to start with that as a guide, and then sometimes I've been lucky enough to meet these people and talk to them. So it's a mixture of framing the project to my strengths, which is close reading, framing the project for the reader so they're not expecting like, you know, oh, I'm a geneticist, I'm going to give you a tome of expertise. And to some extent just saying, you know, you could spend 50 years and not know enough. So you just got to wing it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Did Milton raise his hand? Did I see a raised hand there?
Yeah, I
Hey,
did.
Milton.
Hey, great to see you, and thanks for your writing and this evening event.
Thanks.
I'm wondering about the present, right? You know,
Yeah.
after writing The Shape of the Eye and Fables and the Futures, I'm wondering what keeps you up at night. I mean, I think you are sensitive to the rhetoric that we're hearing and the potential implications of that. And so, you know, having written both of those pieces, I wonder where it takes you right now in this moment.
You know, I was an insomniac anyway, so it's maybe not the best criterion, but everything keeps me up at night. I mean, we've talked about this before, you know, but just one of the things I'm back up a little bit. One of the things I argue against in the book is that idea that the American classical age of eugenics from about 1900 to 1935-ish is gone. That's the bad old days of sterilization. And now, you know, that's not a problem. Science is good. And I think of eugenics as something that is just always present, just sometimes more expressed than others. And we are in a high time of expression. I mean, when you have hysterectomies done under the aegis of ICE, when you have the President of the United States using low IQ as an insult and aiming it specifically at women of color, when you have those things show that we are not done with these ghosts, that they're not even dead. So that keeps me awake at night. I think that, you know, everyone has their own way into it. And to me, obviously, I filter this through my protectiveness of Laura. But yeah, you know, I just want to say November 3rd is my birthday, and I'm really, really hoping the country gives me a great big present. You know, Texas would be great. I would love Texas, but I'll take Arizona.
We'll give you Florida too. Let us know.
Yeah, please. Put a bow on it. Thanks, Milton.
I see a question here in the comments. Anita and Mike want to know how or if your music intersects with your writing. Ah,
right. So for those of you who don't know, I play the guitar. I'm in a band called Mule on Fire. I believe our bass player and sound engineer may be present here. You know, it doesn't. It's really strange. I mean, like you would think being a poet and being a guitarist that I would write songs. And I just don't. I've always kept those things really gated. And I think for me, it's, you know, it's important to, for me, music is a thing, words. And I think writers really, really depend on having some kind of escape where you're just not thinking about words all the time. So I think is a real relief. They both satisfy a courage, but they so far haven't. But you know, never know. Maybe someday. I see a hand.
Yeah, I'm Jim Trent, not administrator. I got a new today, and so I'm still tinkering with the operating system. I would like to know a little more about Laura and how she's doing. I guess she's 19 now?
Yes, she is. And thank you, Jim. This is Jim Trent. His book, Inventing the Feeble Mind, was a history of institutions and thinking about intellectual disability. Could not have written my book without that book. So thank you. It's really good to see you. Laura's doing great. She's done with high school. She's in a post-high school kind of vocational program, and that is meeting on Zoom, which is not nearly as good, but it's the people running it are still doing an amazing job with that limitation. Laura misses seeing her friends in person, but she understands and she's doing well. She worked at the Arc a little bit, and that was she enjoyed that. And right now her sister is across the country and she misses her sister a lot. Which she tells me often. Yeah, but she's doing well. And I checked with her, we were out walking the dog today and I said, hey, I'm going to be reading a couple of stories about you. Is that okay? And this has become a really important thing for parents to think about, is just the idea, agency and consent, and is it cool? And if Laura, so far Laura likes the idea, but had she not, it would have been, there's other stuff to read. Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious, has that played a role in the writing of some of your earlier books? The Shape of the Eye, for example. To what degree did you talk to Laura about her role in that after the fact, or? So
that's an interesting thing. And often when I'm teaching the graduate creative writing workshop, we sometimes get into these ethical issues. And I think they're thorniest when someone cannot articulate what they want. And so that in my case, I started writing The Shape of the Eye not long after Laura was born. And of course, at that time, she couldn't have understood what I was doing, and so I was just kind of going on faith and trying to be true to her, and think a little bit about okay, if she reads this when she's 16, how's she going to feel if she's, as she got older, and then when the book came out, she was totally cool with it. In fact, she calls it her book. Like I would go somewhere to read and she'd be like, how they like my book? They liked your book fine. So fortunately that worked out. Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from Deb in the comments. Deb, if you want to ask that.
Sure, I'll just unmute myself and ask George. Thank you so much for this tremendous reading. I've really enjoyed hearing from you today, and of course across our conversations. And I wanted to ask a question about what would be the best way to be an ally or to contribute to the work that you do, and to be supportive of Laura and others in the disability community? What things can we do that are most helpful, especially if we have representational capital, or if we're teaching, or if we're in communities of inclusivity? Thank you again.
I think that's a fantastic question. I'm going to guess there's 3 people on this thing that can answer it better than I can. I think that it depends on your position. The first thing that comes to mind is educational inclusion. So like, if like, let's say, you know, Laura's out of school now, but one thing she benefited from was being included in general education. It wasn't total, it wasn't complete all the time. She kind of shuttled around, but we felt that most of the time she was welcome there. And I think that a lot of that was because the parents of kids who did not have a disability modeled a sense of welcome. So it wasn't that kind of attitude like, oh, you know, she's going to slow down the regular kids, or she's going to drive them down. They, you know, where people model that welcome is critical. So for parents, that's one specific thing to do. I think that, you know, this is parallel but very different from the what people have been called to do in terms of thinking about Black Lives Matter. But one thing that people can do is just internal, like, you know, I know that when Laura came along, I became aware of all sorts of biases I had no idea I had, but I became aware of them in a very, you know, sudden and definite way. But I think, you know, one thing one can do, and this is more introspective or private, is you're walking down the street, you see someone who is obviously different. What's your reaction and why? And I think that's a critical thing to begin with. The other thing I would say is just more broadly is, you know, if you're part of organizations, do those organizations welcome people with disabilities? And this goes well beyond Down syndrome, well beyond intellectual disability, but for, you know, people with disabilities whom I follow on Twitter, on social media, talk about the endless barriers just to ordinary participation. And so kind of trying to see with those lenses and change it where you can, I think those are some ways to go. And thanks, Deb. Deb, you all should listen to Deb's podcast, Technically Human, because it's awesome. I'm not just saying that because I was on it, but it is really, really good.
I think I see a question from Lisa in the comments. Lisa, do you want to ask or explain?
Well, I was just responding. I'm Lisa Nicholson. I was internet friend of Allison's and part of the interview cohort for her research study. And I have a daughter who's 21 with Down syndrome, and we feel strongly that a large part of her success in terms of inclusion was that she entered the community and her peers, her membership with her peers at the earliest stage possible, which was, you know, preschool. And I mean, as soon as she could sit up, basically, she was in preschool, which was an inclusive preschool and an early learning center, really, not like a daycare, but really like a school. And so all those kids in that setting followed her along through elementary school. And that really consolidated. A lot of those kids understood her communication almost better than we did. They would be like interpreters for her as she went through and started to expand her peer group, you know, from that smaller peer group out into the bigger one, as the elementary schools all kind of merged into a larger pool. So I feel like that's really important for parents to know, and for others to, you know, who don't have children with these disabilities, to encourage their kids, to invite them to birthday parties, you know, include their parents in social interactions, because that was invaluable to us, and I think to her. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much for doing this for Allison. It really, it's very moving to me.
Thanks, Lisa. It was an honor, and just being able to do it. You know, Rachel, my co-editor and co-author, Rachel, Allison, and I are all good friends. We're all writers. I'll have a child with Down syndrome, and we collaborated and we did, presentations together at academic conferences. And this experience of collaboration was just so strange because it was in a really good way, but it was, all the time I worked on this project, I was missing my friend. And all the time I worked on it, I was feeling the responsibility of speaking for Allison because she couldn't speak for herself anymore. So it was just a completely different kind of project and interesting to do something collaborative as well.
See, Marcia has a hand up.
Hey, Marcia.
George, I have a million questions, but I can't prioritize any of them. So maybe I'll call you soon, but I just wanted to say hello and thank you. I'm here with some of my students from Disability Studies at UC Berkeley. And I just love that you're doing this. And I want to appreciate your writing, which I use and have recently quoted in something that I'm working on. So hello, and hello to your family as well.
Yeah. So it's great to see you, and it makes me a little nostalgic for the the times where we could like get on a plane and go somewhere, because the last time we saw each other was at the San Francisco Library when you were interviewing me there. Yeah. It also makes me feel a little bit like you're there with all your disability studies students, and you should be answering these questions really, rather listen to what you have to say. But thank you.
We have some time left. Marcia, is there any question that you think would be beneficial for us all to hear you ask?
It's not very clear as a question articulated yet. I'd love to hear you talk about how you think about your audience, your readers, when you're trying to reach, and with maybe an advocacy kind of perspective, whether it's from your memoir perspective or scholarly. How do you think about in such a broad array of perspectives? Something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think that, I mean, I have, because I don't identify as disabled, I don't come at these issues from that perspective. I am, and so one thing when I'm thinking of an audience, it's really broad, because it might be people who are like, yeah, let's engineer the genome and let's get some better humans out there stat, and there are other people who experience these things that, like, I'm quoting them, but I don't experience it, day to day. And I think to bridge that, I have to be, this is a little bit connected to what Stephen asked, is just be very careful about how I frame my reply. I don't want to pull my punches on something I feel really strongly about. So there are times where I'm just like, we'll just critique something or just say, I just find this to be completely wrong. There's other times where I want to just be more scholarly in tone and leave some room. So it's really situational from moment to moment, like where you want to just come in really hard and be like, I'm not compromising on my daughter's value or her right to have a place in this world. But at the other time to say, there are some really interesting ideas, and even if they're wrong-headed, I want to discuss them in a way that leaves some room for people to come in. So trying to be pragmatic about persuasion, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the wish, the hope. Marcia's, there's a quote from Marcia, one of the two epigraphs for the book. The one epigraph is, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And the other one is a world where everyone is welcome is the first priority, and that's from Marcia. So, Vicki.
Hey, George.
Hey.
Good to see you.
You too.
I'm wondering if you'd put on your now retired, but your former hat as a parent in the Corvallis schools, and talking about persuasion and audience.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit just about your experience handling contact with school? I have an autistic grandson here in the Corvallis schools, and they're now having a new program where it's something like whole body listening or something. And the whole idea of it is that you must watch your Zoom. These are first graders. You must watch Zoom with your hands in your lap, and you have to keep eye contact with the teacher at all times. And you can't get up out of your chair at home where you're watching Zoom. And it's, I can imagine that there are many, many 6-year-olds besides my grandson who simply, he doesn't like eye contact that much. You know, he's not crazy about people looking at him on Zoom. And so what did you learn about trying to navigate a system that isn't doing it on purpose? You know, they're not doing this to be mean. They think it's going to make Zoom better.
Yeah.
Maybe better for the teachers. I don't know. But anyway, I just wonder if you have any words of wisdom from your own experience with public school.
Sure. Just give me a minute to scroll through the participant list and make sure that there's no administrators from the school district here, and then I'll tell you what I really think. So this is absurd. There is no first grader who's capable of robotically zazen whole body listening. And I would just say that the phrase whole body listening is one of these examples of using holistic, crunchy language to disguise controlling repressive practices. I mean, this is absurd. So speaking broadly, especially in the beginning, when Laura was in kindergarten and first grade, our thought was, we're going to be working with these people for a long time. Can't just pick up and go like, we'll go to some other school. It's like, this is we're building relationships. So we did understand that it was necessary to build relationships, and that meant compromise here and there. But there are times where if you're just facing something completely unworkable, that you have to get a little sterner. So, you know, the thing is, you know, more honey works better than vinegar, but you gotta keep a can of vinegar ready. And so to me, speaking really specifically, that the thing that works is to use the language of the law. So, you know, if the law mandates or tends towards inclusion, and a free, appropriate public education with one's peers, and a rule makes it practically impossible for the person to access that education, then that's something to question. To me, it's funny. It's like, I think if they suspended that, they'd have better outcomes overall. I can't sit still and listen without moving around for 15 minutes. When I was 6, I sure as hell couldn't. But I would say, you know, with autistics, some people just need to stim. Some people just need to do those motions, and that's in order to concentrate.
Exactly.
And so if, you know, so that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is, it is very easy for someone to get moved out of the student box and into the problem or the charge box. And if you're, you know, it was different with Laura because like, oh, she's so cute. And we were like, yeah, she's cute, but she's also here to learn things. And so, you know, unfortunately, a lot of burden falls on parents, grandparents to be familiar with the acronyms that make bureaucrats' eyes light up with happiness, such as FAPE, and deploy those as needed. But that just seems like if they lifted that, then things would be just better for everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, George.
I hope it helps.
Okay. We'll talk again.
We'll talk. Yeah, call me. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you for your insight on that one.
Sure.
We are just about out of time, unfortunately. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. This was a fascinating conversation with George. And George, I truly appreciate your insight and your thoughtfulness and your willingness to share your time with us. Please keep us in mind when your future essay collection drops.
You'll be the first to know.
And to our audience members, support George by buying his books, one or all three, here with us at Grassroots. You can find it by clicking the link that I pasted into the chat or on our website. Your support helps small bookstores like us stay open and bring authors to our community. So on that note, thanks again, everyone. We hope to see you for more events soon. Good night.
And I just want to say before you cut, Ashley, this is 2020. It's a different kind of year. So a book warning about an ableist consumerist dystopia makes a great holiday gift. Thanks.
Very true. Yeah, good pitch. All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
George.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
George.